Okay, this morning I thought we'd explore a little bit the role of assistant coaches in our program. I was very fortunate to have a group of 12 or 15 assistant coaches over the years during that 30-year period that I was head coach. And I think that I can say with all moral certainty that all but two of those were really high contributors. They were all good coaches. And probably the two best out of that whole lot were Pat Keitches and Dave Dunnigan. And Keitch was my very first real assistant coach. And he, just to give you an idea of kind of a guy he was, we hired him as an assistant football coach, and he was asked to go ahead and do the track also. And so one day, it was just before our national meet, and I get a telephone call from him at home in the evening. He said, "Coach?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "This is Pat Keitches. I've just been hired as assistant track coach. I understand you're leaving to the national meet tomorrow. Is that right?" And I said, "Yeah, that's correct." He said, "Would it be okay if I came along?" And I was saying to myself, "Geez, I haven't even met this guy." And so I said, "Sure, come on." And so 4:30 the next morning, I pull up in front of the Fuhrer Fieldhouse, and here he is sitting on his suitcase waiting for me. And we introduced ourselves, and during that 4-day period or 5-day period that we were together, we pretty well hammered out what each of our roles was going to be in the track and field program. And Keitch was, he was, as a person, as a personality, he was the epitome, I think, of an assistant coach. He had the facility to see problems, see something that needed to get done, and do it without being told. And once you got used to that, as a head coach, once you got used to that, boy, was that a load off your mind, because you knew that he was going to take care of all the detailed junk that you were missing. And he had a terrific personality with kids, with athletes. Kids just loved him. He was very competitive. He was very gregarious, liked to meet people, just liked people in general. And I think that's really a critical thing for coaches, whether they be head coaches or assistant coaches or whatever. I think that ability, the facility to meet people, to really innately like people, like to be around people, at ease in terms of relating to them, either verbally or in other ways. The good coaches that I've had, assistant coaches, have all had that facility and are comfortable with relating on a one-to-one basis with the athlete. And and of course, and Keitch was really good with that, and he was very competitive. He was our defensive coach in football, and he was a very competitive guy. He wasn't with us very long. He was only with us for about 2.5 years. But during that period, he instilled in a group of kids the idea that we were, by golly, going to win. And whatever it took, that's what we were going to do. And he went on, left on too early, really. And went on into the financial business with the Commercial Federal Savings and Loan, wound up within a year, he was the Western District manager for Commercial Federal, and then went on from there and went to the Denver area and was the Denver manager for Commercial Federal for a long time. But he just did a terrific job for us in that really he taught us that he got our kids thinking win, that we were by golly better than everybody else, and we were going to win no matter what. And we could go into a meet, you know, the underdog and come out as a winner. And we did. You know, we won 4 conference championships 4 years in a row. After he got here, for the next 4 years, we were undefeated in any kind of meet, whether it was a dual meet or a triangular or a 5-teamer or a conference meet or whatever. The only meet we didn't win was a national championship. And that was, to in a large part, it was due to his influence with the kids. And I don't know, do you have that picture of the team? He's dead center in the middle of that picture in the front row. And he was pretty excited about that time when we won that last championship, and made it 4 years in a row for a group of kids that were pretty darn good. And Dunny is very much like Keitches. Dunnigan is a very much like Keitch in that he is very gregarious. He gets along with people easily. He meets people. He doesn't have a problem conversing with athletes on their level. He's probably as good from that standpoint as anybody we've ever had. And the big thing with Dunny is his loyalty. He was with me for 20 out of the 30 years. And it was a great relationship, is a great relationship. And Dave is probably the brightest of all of our assistant coaches that I had, smartest. Guy is really intelligent and understands the basic, very, very basic physiological and anatomical fundamentals of athletics, of sport, and can convey that to the athlete without using a lot of fancy jargon, and talk to the athlete at their level, at a level that is comfortable for the athlete. And Dave is really, he's really a bright guy. He really is. He and I have gotten along together. You know, I tried to recruit him out of high school as a half-miler. He was a skinny little kid, and that's hard for people to believe now at 230 pounds and 6'5" or whatever he is. But he didn't start the throwing thing in getting involved with coaching the throws until he was, I would suppose, maybe 5 or 10 years out of college. And he went out to Denver, and John Green, one of my other old assistants, was a head coach at Centennial High School in Aurora, Colorado. And he talked Dunnigan into helping him, and he gradually gravitated into the coaching the throws. And he had never been a thrower. He was a half-miler in high school. And but Dave became one of the better technical coaches. He understands the mechanics of those events, those throwing events. And he studied very, very diligently, very diligently, to keep up with the cutting edge of coaching those events. And I think that's pretty evident with Skirman's, one of Dave's old guys, winning the U.S. championship and qualifying for the World Games in the discus. And Dave had a lot of influence on that particular happening, because he had Skirman's when he was a rookie punk, you know, and took him through 4 years of college and a national championship and all of that, and gave him the fundamental basis, the foundation for his future success, and that has come to fruition this year with a U.S. championship. And Dave, I don't think he probably takes enough credit for that kind of stuff. The guy could bring kids along that I never would have thought. You know, Danny Underwood becomes a national champion. He's a skinny little kid from Crete High. I'm not even sure he placed in the state meet in high school. And he brings him along and he makes a national championship out of him. And he had probably dozens of kids like that, that just through sheer willpower or obstinance or whatever, he was going to, by gosh, make a winner out of them. And I think that's a thing that goes through being a good assistant coach, no matter what era or what, you know, year or whatever. The successful ones have all been people who could create that winning attitude in our athletes. They're much more important from that standpoint than the head coach is. Realistically, most athletes don't listen to what the head coach says about half the time. They identify more with the assistant coaches because those are the people that are working with them on a daily basis every single day, and that's who they identify with. And if those assistant coaches have the proper attitude, the proper winning attitude, then you're going to be successful no matter what the head coach does. Now, the head coach has to give the assistant coach some leeway in how you approach things. I always approached it from the standpoint, as a head coach, I always felt like I would approach it from the standpoint that the assistant coach is the head coach of their event group, whatever events they were going to coach. And they were the head coach for those events. I wasn't going to mess with them unless I absolutely had to. Gave them pretty much free rein in that, in those events. And, you know, it was fairly difficult early. You know, we only had 2 coaches. And so you took 22 events, and track and field is a little different from a lot of other sports in that the 22 different events, and they're very, very different. As different as the shot put and discus are from the high jump and the high hurdles. You know, totally different skills, totally different kind of kid, totally different kind of approach that you have to make to be successful. And the skill levels are, you know, obviously different. A lot of people ask me how we did it with 2 coaches. And I cannot tell you how we did it, but we did it. You know, it was just there and you had to deal with it. And we just split them in half, and every time a new assistant came in, we went through the same thing, you know. I always let the assistant coach do the picking. Pick what events you wanted to, you feel comfortable with. And then I would pick up whatever was left. And so from my standpoint as a head coach, it was really, I tried to put the assistant coach in the best possible position to be successful. That was my goal, my role as I saw it. And I recognize the fact that the assistant coach had to be a person who could relate to the athlete more so than me. I could not tell you the number of times when I would be totally ignorant as a head coach, totally ignorant about what's going on in a team, and the assistant coach or coaches would all know exactly what was going on and what the tenor of the team was and whether there was any problems or whatever. They were really clued in because that's who the athlete identified with, the guy that's on the track or on the field working with them on a daily basis. And the head coach is somebody over here that isn't quite that kind of relationship, where the assistant coach has a much more direct influence on the success and failure of the individual athlete, and ultimately then the success or failure of the team as a whole. And so I always tried to give the assistant coaches the greatest amount of leeway in terms of how they dealt with whatever kind of problem we would have. And I never questioned them in terms of entries or that sort of thing. They knew what was going on. They knew the condition of a particular athlete much better than I did. In their event areas that they were responsible for, they knew better than I did what that athlete was capable of doing. And so I always gave them as much leeway as I possibly could in terms of how they dealt with entries in meets and that kind of thing. I don't think that except for maybe 2 occasions, I don't think that I had an assistant coach that didn't bring something unique and positive to the table in terms of contributing to our overall success. Everybody was a little different, both in their knowledge and in their approach, but they all had something that was positive to our program, to help the program, and and every one of them was a different personality, obviously, and everybody approached their chore in terms of coaching, teaching a little differently. Some guys were really into strength and conditioning and that kind of thing. Other guys were more interested in the pure skill of an event. Some were really into imparting knowledge. Others didn't care whether the kid understood what he was doing or not, as long as he did it and did it correctly. So everybody was a little different, and but the ultimate success that we had was based on, in my opinion, their passion for the sport. The passion for the sport is critical for the assistant coach, more so even than the head coach. If the assistants aren't passionate about track and field, in this case, then forget it. It's not going to happen for you. The success and failure of a track and field team is based to a large extent, I think, on passion that the assistant coaches have for the sport, and their ability to transmit that passion to the athlete. And so I think that that's much more important, I think, than the technical skills. That you can know. I've had coaches who knew the technical part of it, but couldn't communicate it, didn't have the passion, and couldn't communicate that to the athlete. And the athletes pick up on that right now. An athlete will pick up on whether or not you're, as a coach, that you're either passionate about your sport or don't really care a whole lot. And that's that I think is really critical. The two failures that I had, two assistant coaches that I had that were absolute failures, were not at all passionate about track and field. They were into some other sport, and track and field was just time they had to spend there. That was their sentence, and they really didn't care a whole lot about track. Now, if you talk to them, maybe they would have said they did, but they really didn't. And the kids sensed that right away, that the assistant coach was not really turned on with track and field. And as soon as a kid picks that up, boy, you got a heck of a problem then. One of the things I think that's really important from a head coaching standpoint is that you listen to your assistant coaches and you actually hear what they're saying, and don't be afraid to change your own opinion based on what they're telling you, and develop a rapport with the assistant coach that they're not afraid to come in and visit with you and voice their opinions. And I've seen situations where the coaches were so stubborn or hard-headed or whatever that they wouldn't listen to the assistant coaches. And boy, when that happens, then you got potentially some real problems. When it's going to be my way or the highway, and we're not going to even consider anything that the assistant coach says, that's not good. And I always tried as a head coach, I always tried to have an open mind and just, whatever you guys, if you think we need to do something or to change something or recruit somebody or whatever, for God's sake, say so, and we'll listen to you. And I think that part of our success was based on that relationship of the head coach to the assistant coaches, because I think that's a critical thing in any kind of success that you have. And you have to be, as a head coach, you have to be kind of flexible, because over a 30-year period, I had 14 or 15 assistant coaches, different guys. And they all had different backgrounds. They all had different strengths and weaknesses. They all had different events that they were interested in. And to utilize their strengths and to minimize their weaknesses, that's the head coach's job. And I was very fortunate that only two of them really didn't have much to bring to the table. And we survived a year with him, but it cost us in a couple of different occasions. I think the most important thing is the direct relationship of the assistant coach to the athlete. And sometimes as a head coach, I caught myself being jealous of that, being jealous of not having that relationship with the athlete, and other than the ones that I was directly responsible for. And I think that's another important thing. I think two things a head coach has to do. Number one, I think you have to keep your hand in coaching an event, some event or events, so that you maintain this relationship with at least some of the athletes. And then the second thing is to recognize the fact that you are a different breed of cat than the assistant coach in the eyes of the athlete. And many of the athletes don't see the head coach as being somebody that they can walk into and say, hey, I got this problem or whatever. Now, I've had two or three kids that were able to do that or willing to do that. But most athletes don't. They go to the assistant coach. That's who they identify with. And so picking and choosing, if you have that opportunity to picking and choosing of the right people as assistant coaches is really a critical thing in the success of anybody, of any program. And from my standpoint, I'm just confident that the success that we had over the years in that 30-year span, the successes we had were primarily due to the quality of people that we were able to recruit to be assistant coaches. And I think of what Dunnigan and I went through. Man, two guys trying to coach cross country, fall track, indoor, outdoor, put on meets, all this stuff. I remember one time we put on a decathlon, just the two of us. We timed and we measured and we figured scores and everything. Two guys, and we just, man, we were running so fast, moving between events that we met ourselves coming back. And we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, and how did we accomplish what we did? And it was hard work. It really was. And I was blessed to have, the assistant coaches that I had. And like I said, every one of them brought something to the table that was positive. And it was my job then to figure out what that was, and then to help them to utilize that to the greatest degree that we could possibly do it. I don't know, I think right now, the one thing Ed Fye has done is to surround himself with some of the greatest coaches that I have seen in a long, long time. And a lot of them. Lord, I don't know what I would have done with 5 or 6 coaches, much less 8 or 10. And Ed has been able to surround himself with a large number of very, very technically sound assistant coaches who know what time of day it is. I think Dave Ziola is the very, very best jump coach around. This guy is really, he's very low key, and you don't see much or hear much about him, but Ziola is as good a coach as there is in the United States in the jumps and the horizontal jumps. And his technical ability is an understanding of the techniques of track and field is second to none. And of course, we already talked about Dunny, and he continues to do an amazing job. And you know, Brad Ginny was one of our guys, and came back to be the head cross-country coach and does a great job. Is passionate about. They all have the one thing that all these assistant coaches that he has right now is a passion for track and field. Track and field is a big deal for them, and I think that's the key to whatever success that we have had in the last whatever number of years it is now, 15 years or so, is the fact that Ed has been smart enough to surround himself with really, really passionate track and field coaches, guys who really are into it just because they are, and for no good reason, I guess. And that, I think if he continues to do that and he listens to the assistant coaches, and that we will continue to have great success in track and field at Doane. The other thing I wanted to talk about this morning, if we have time, is the changes that went on after Title IX, when the women, we began to have a significant women's program, and I can still remember the day in 77, 8. Don Ziegler was our dean then, called me in his office, and he said, we've had a change in our personnel, teaching personnel, and we need to, President Heckman and I decided that we're going to have a combined program of, we want to combine the men's and women's track program. And what do you think about that? And I said, well, you know, that's okay, and we can do that. I'm not afraid of coaching women, but we're going to do it on our terms, and we're going to have one track team. We're not going to have a men's team or a women's team. We're going to have a track team, and everybody's going to be treated alike. Everybody's going to get the same coaching. Everybody's going to get the same equipment issue. Everybody's going to get the same shoe allowance. They're going to get the same meal money on the road. We're going to travel together. We're going to go to the same meets whenever possible. It was still, in those days, it was still a lot. Some of the meets were still gender specific, and so it wasn't always possible to take women and men to the same meet. But whenever that was possible, we would, and then we would adjust our schedule to accommodate that. And it was going to be one program. We're not going to have separate but equal, you know, that concept. We're going to have, everybody's going to be on the same plane. The coaches are going to coach men and women by events, and you're going to be an event coach or forget it, you know. Don't have that option. And so and they agreed. And I said, now it's going to cost some money because we're going to have to hire an assistant coach. We're going to have to hire, we're going to have to buy that many more suits, warm-up suits, whatever, uniforms. And they agreed, although I don't think they really understood what they were letting themselves in for. But, and you know, early on it wasn't that big a deal because we weren't talking about that many people. You know, our women's team with probably 12 or 15 people. And do you have that picture of the women's team? And the picture that you're going to see is our women's team 1979 or 80 and 80, I think, pretty much, that won conference championships. We jumped into that women's thing pretty fast and had some success early on. In 1979, 80, we won the conference championships, and with, I don't know what, 15 girls, and they were pretty. Some of them were pretty talented. Some of them were just. The Misick sisters were about as competitive a pair as I've seen, and they could do. They were very competitive, and that was the thing. One of the surprises for me, and one of the things that I had to readjust in my thinking, was the actual competitiveness that the female brought into track and field. The women were, that surprised the heck out of me. I did not believe that they would be that competitive. And Misick sisters were from St. Ed, Nebraska, and they were about as competitive as you will ever want to see. They must have run, in that conference meet, I'm guessing they ran 10 events between them. And there was, if you have a team of 15 kids, you got to cover all those events effectively. You've got to be have a lot of people who can cover multiple events and are willing to. And boy, they were extremely competitive kids. And Tom Hood was my coach, assistant coach at that time, and he did a great job. Tom was he liked track and field. He didn't quite have the passion that some of the other guys did for it, although he's still involved in track and field as the referee of the state high school championship meet, and has been for years. And he was a good coach. He was a good technical coach. He was a lot like Dunnigan from that standpoint. He knew the techniques and the skills and the mechanics, taught kinesiology and physiology and those kinds of courses, the scientific courses. So he understood a lot of the mechanics of the underlying laws that govern the techniques of and dictated the techniques in track and field. And Tom was a good coach from that standpoint. And he was assistant coach 2 different times. He was my fallback guy. If I needed an assistant coach, I knew I could always go and con him into helping us for a year or 2 or whatever. And but he was my assistant when the women started having some success. We went in with the idea that we're going to have one team, one goal, one championship. And that's the way I approached it. I don't know how anybody else thought about it, but that was the approach that I made. I always, during that period, always scored every one of our meets combined total, men and women's. And that's where we decided whether we were successful or not. If the men were ahead, the men carried the women for, those first, 8 years or so, for the most part. And then for the next 15 years, the women carried the men, as far as team scores are concerned. And we scored every meet, team combined total, men and women, because that's the way I wanted everybody thinking, this is a team. We're all in this together. It's us against the world. and whether it was an assistant coach or the athlete or whoever. And if we could develop, I felt if we could develop that kind of an attitude, that we would be successful. And now, did we have to change some things? Yeah, we did. You know, I was, for as long as I had a single gender men's program, I was really a negative coach. I would challenge kids. I'd tell them they weren't worth a dime and they couldn't beat anybody, and just really rip them. And they would respond with, by God, I'm going to show Beile that we're better than he thinks we are. And as soon as we started getting the women in the program, it dawned on me pretty fast that we can't do that. That women generally react better to positive reinforcement than they do negative. And in coaching track, 90% of the time, you're using a negative approach. Here's what you did wrong. This is why you failed. And in fact, about half the events, failure is built in. The high jump, you always end up, no matter if you win the Olympic championship, you always wind up failing at some point. The bar keeps going up until you fail, and that's the end of the event. And a pole vault is the same way, and most of the field events are like that. So there's a failure concept built in track and field. And it finally dawned on me after a little while that particularly the women, but maybe the guys would benefit from a more positive approach. And so we intentionally then tried to move to using more of a positive approach to motivating athletes, in motivating athletes. And that was a big thing. And then obviously we had to change the language a little bit in some of our squad meetings. There were some things that were said in some of our squad meetings early on when it was single gender men that you could get away with, locker room talk pretty easily, and that wasn't going to fly with the ladies. I think one of the like I said, the big changes in my understanding and in my concept of because nobody knew what coaching women was like. I mean, we're plowing new ground here, folks. We had, the only female that I knew very well was my wife, and she's not an athlete by any stretch of the imagination. But and how we would approach coaching females this is all new ground, and we were trial and error, and we made a lot of mistakes, boy oh boy, and had some kids quit us, and I'm sure some people didn't perform as well as they might have because we weren't approaching it properly, but I was surprised at how competitive women would be when you turned them loose, and that increased, I think. And now we accept it. What is this? How many years later? 50 years later, 60, whatever. We accept female competitiveness as a fact of life, and but in those days we had no clue as to the way it was going to play out, and people maybe think it's strange that we even had a question in our mind as how competitive a female could be, but we didn't have any idea. There was no background to it at all. So we had to kind of grow by trial and error, just whatever would work, worked, and we learned from our athletes as much as we taught them in this respect, I think. Now, not all schools got on the bandwagon right away. There were still a number of schools early on, even into the 80s, that didn't buy into women's athletics, and certainly didn't buy into combined teams that still maintained separate coaching staffs and separate schedules and separate training and whatever. And that was, in my opinion, that was a negative thing. I don't, once we decided we're going to do this and have a program for women, then we owed it to them, and we owed it to our school to have the same competitive opportunity as the men did. And the combining of the program, I think, was the big thing for us, was the big thing for our success, both men and women. I think as soon as we got into this total team thing, that it gave us a lever to ensure success for both groups, for both genders. And but not all schools bought into that. I know of a couple of schools in our conference that it took them a change of coaching staff to get involved. There were some coaches that just didn't want to either be bothered with the coaching of women. Now, in those days, coaching women was a lot more work because they didn't have the opportunity to develop a lot of skills back down the line because there just wasn't that much time. We're talking about 72 to 77, 5-year period. Barely got one class through 4 years of high school. And the high school coaches, they were brand new with all this. And so you had to spend a lot more time coaching the women and dealing with the basic concepts. Now, that was, as I see it, that was a positive thing for our total program. Our men benefited from that we had to go back and start from almost dead scratch from the technical standpoint in teaching these skills to everybody, men and women combined. And so the men benefited from that review, and in many cases, they had been taught poor skills. And so they benefited from learning from the beginning, again, going back and going through all the steps to learn the techniques in particular events. So it was a positive thing for everybody, really. And as far as I could see, from my standpoint, it wasn't a day from day one. As soon as we started the combined team, I thought it was a positive move on the college's part. And those schools that resisted it are, in some cases, still feeling the effects of their inability to accommodate females in their athletic programs. The one thing that I did find that was really positive, and I still believe it's true, is that women are easier to coach from the standpoint, from a number of standpoints, but one of the most important one is they don't second guess the coach nearly as much as men do. Men are much more likely to to second guess a coach in what he's telling them, and you know, and give me the old. I won the Class D championship doing it this way, so this is good enough. And women are much more open to change their technique, change their skills, and from that standpoint, they're a lot easier to coach. Yeah.